Good morning, media. Good morning, Canada. Welcome to the national table of the First Nations Confederacy of Cultural Education Centers news release. The First Nations Confederacy of Cultural Education Centers is a national organization that has been mandated to protect, promote, revitalize, and maintain the First Nation languages of Canada. Our national organization has been established since 1971. It comprises of board members representing each of the regions across Canada. The board members represent their constituent centers in each of their regions. Regardless of the diversity of the centers across the land, cultural centers have one common thread, one common vision, and that is for the protection and the promotion of our ancestral languages. The Board of Governors maintain their position that First Nation languages of Canada are the first and original languages that must be protected, must be recognized, must be honored through treaties and inherent rights of our people. We strongly believe that our languages is the spirit of our soul, the spirit of our heritage, and the spirit of our identity. We strongly believe that languages is a gift from the Creator. The national table stands here with me today. I am Claudette Commanda, the Executive Director of the First Nations Confederacy of Cultural Education Centers. The National Board stands very strongly in its position to call upon the Federal Government of Canada and how it will commit to protecting, revitalizing First Nation languages. Standing with me is our President, Chief Morris Swan Shanakapo, who will be presenting to you our position of our national table. Miigwech.
Miigwech Claudette. Menewe Ashish Nikasa, Dogimakanyo, Ditibinezi. Good morning. I'm the chief of the Rolling River First Nation. I've been involved with the cultural centers for quite some time, and this is actually the gateway to my chieftainship, and also allowed me to find my own identity in working through the cultural centers and learning who we are, also maintaining our languages. Normally I speak from the heart, but we did prepare yesterday as we're meeting here in Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg. So I want to read this for you. First Nation Confederacy of Cultural Education Centers called on the federal government to commit to the revitalization of First Nation languages in Canada. The First Nation Confederacy of Cultural Education Centers is a national not-for-profit organization representing cultural education centers across Canada. Since our inception, the organization has been mandated to protect and promote and revitalize our ancestral language and culture. The FNCCEC has a membership of 55 centers and programs across the country who deliver language and cultural education for their First Nation communities. Our elders teach us that ancestral languages of our people give us spirit. Language is part of our identity. Language is the soul of our people, and our language guides us to make good decisions. Our language is vital to ensure strong and healthy First Nation communities. Currently, there are approximately 60 ancestral languages which represent every First Nation community across this land of ours. Our languages are in jeopardy. If we do not revitalize our languages, we lose the spirit of our people. We want to save our languages for the future survival of our next generation. And that's a quote by Elder Elmer Courchene, who stands to my right here. The FNCCEC and our Board of Governors have been following the federal election campaigns of each of the four parties with great interest. In fact, some were very pleased that during the first few days of the campaign trail, First Nation issues seem to be at the forefront for some of the parties. In recent weeks, it has been noted that the election issues taking priority relate more to activities happening in other countries opposed to the serious circumstances First Nations people continue to experience daily in Canada. The Canadian government is very generous in providing $710 million for humanitarian efforts and security, stabilization in Syria, and allocating $238 million to Afghanistan for the purpose of building schools and supporting education in that country. We understand the hard times that the Syrian and Afghan people are going through. However, we cannot help but take notice Canada's First and Original people and our First Nation women, men, and children continue to live in deplorable third world conditions in our own country. Most recently, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released a document Calls to Action. One of the many recommendations calls upon the federal government to enact an Aboriginal Language Act that incorporates the following principles. 1. Aboriginal languages are a fundamental and valued element of Canadian culture, and there is an urgency to preserve them. 2. Aboriginal language rights are reinforced by the treaties. 3. The federal government has a responsibility to provide sufficient funds for Aboriginal language revitalization and preservation. 4. The preservation, revitalization, and strengthening of Aboriginal languages and culture are best managed by Aboriginal peoples and their communities. And 5. Funding for Aboriginal language initiatives must reflect the diversity of Aboriginal languages. It is crucial that the federal government supports the revitalization of First Nation languages. Our languages are a fundamental element in our identity and cultural heritage. First Nation languages are the first languages of this country. We do not have a homeland to return to for the sake of relearning our languages or culture in the way that French people can return to France or their mother country. The Polish people can return to Poland. The Indian people can return to India. In essence, every nation of people that come to Canada to settle in this country that's well known as a mosaic country, where you can enjoy your culture and speak your language. We as First Nation people do not have a homeland to return to, for we are on our ancestral homeland in this country called Canada. This is why it's so vital for First Nation ancestral languages to be revitalized and protected. And of course, that's a quote coming from myself and the understanding of what is going on in our country here. The First Nations Confederacy of Cultural Educations is asking what will be done to implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada calls to action on language and culture, and how will the federal government commit to the revitalization of the First Nations language in Canada and work in collaboration with First Nation communities. And I'm just going to get Claudette to talk about some of the news media that's been out there, yesterday's paper. Claudette?
I think it's very important that Canadians, they educate themselves and that they understand and respect the serious issues that we are bringing forward with respect to our languages and our cultural education. If Canada is so generous in giving out millions of dollars to support education in other countries, then Canada certainly has to recognize and to honor and to respect and give generously to support First Nations education here in Canada, to support language education, to support cultural education. The news media just recently released yesterday in the Winnipeg Free Press, dated September 8th, 2015, an article called Lessons in Recommitting to Global Education. I quote the paragraph. It says, disappointingly, Canadian government support for education abroad in development plummeted by almost half. $344 million was committed in 2014 compared to the $655 million committed in 2010. This is a travesty when we look at the disparity that exists in First Nations education opposed to education abroad. Canada must commit to supporting First Nations education, and in First Nations education, we find the elements and the fundamental values of our languages, our cultural education. And this is the work that our cultural centers have been doing for the last 40 years. Cultural education, supporting First Nations education on the premise and the foundation of our languages and culture. It is so critical, it is so important that our cultural centers continue their work. It is our children who deserve the best, our children who deserve that inherent right to who they are, our children to deserve to express their spirit and their culture of being Anishinaabe or whoever they call themselves in their language. Presently, we have a youth amongst us, and that young boy, he sits here with us. He's a student. We're encouraging his education. He's a young boy that will walk his road into becoming a man. And what is really extremely important is that he has his identity and his culture, which he will find in his language. And where and who will support that will be our communities, will be our elders, will be our mothers and our fathers and our grandmothers and grandfathers, our educators, our language and cultural frontline workers. And we go back to the critical message here, and that is Canada, the federal government, must commit to the revitalization of First Nation languages. Canada and Canadians, and even the world at large, must educate themselves, must honor and recognize, and must admit that the first languages of this land called Canada are the ancestral languages of the people that stand here presently before you. Standing here with me and our President, Chief Morris Shanakapo, is the diverse First Nations from across the land, representing every community, every language across Canada. Recent reports tell us once again that Canada's failing Aboriginal students. Why? Many reasons, but importantly, because adequate resourcing is not provided for First Nations education. Our own studies tell us, our own studies show us that positive outcomes, positive educational outcomes result from language and culture, result from when our students are provided their education on the foundations and the pillars of our language and culture. That is why it is so important that languages continue to be supported, continue to be protected, continue to be revitalized, and continue to be maintained not only for today, but forevermore, because our children depend on this. Our children have a right to a future. Our children have a right to equal opportunities, dignity, and justice. And that is what our ancestors stood on and fought for to ensure that we are here today, and we have that responsibility for our children. And Canada, you have that responsibility to First Nations. You have that fiduciary responsibility from your own law, Section 9124 of the 1867 British North American Act, Canada's first constitution, and Canada's second constitution, Section 35 of the 1982. Miigwech.
So we challenge the four campaigning parties that are going across our country, vying for the leadership of this country. We challenge you for us to be heard. We challenge you to put more activity at our table and to come to sit with us, to learn about our people and what our contributions are to this great country. We challenge you to make this an election issue, to see what you have for our languages, for our cultural education centers. We are all related.